think you'd be hard-pressed these days to find anyone who isn't familiar with Devil May Cry. Even if they don't recognize everyone's favorite white-haired, red jacket-wearing protagonist, there's a chance they've heard a song, or listened to a friend talk about the game, or saw something related to the title online. The legacy of Devil May Cry is cemented in action games, and will be forever. And it all started in 2001 with the original Devil May Cry. This legacy is what drove me to try out the entire Devil May Cry series in 2023, and I figured what better game to start with than the one that started it all. For a little bit on my background regarding the DMC series, I admittedly had played 5 around late 2021. I really can't say I remember too much from it, but it did cause one of my friends to send me DMC 4, as well as the HD collection of the first 3 games on Steam with the hopes that I'd play it. I always told them I'd get around to it, which of course meant I never did. As time passed though, I met more people that talked about Devil May Cry and said it was a fantastic series, and even the first few games, aside from 2 of course, aged fairly well and were still enjoyable to play. I decided I'd sit down and play through all 6 games, yes, including DMC Devil May Cry, and build my own opinion on this crazy series. While some people said to go in chronological order, that being 3, then 1, then 2, then 4 and 5, I figured I'd want to see how the series evolved over time in terms of gameplay, and just generally how the game was made. Thus began my adventure to what would become one of my favorite game series, so much so that I'm making this video. As for the content of this video, I'm going to be dissecting the game mission by mission, sprinkling in bits about the gameplay, the story, the level design, the bosses, etc. I want to focus on each element and give my opinion on them as someone who first played the game in 2023. Try not to fret, I know this game is old. I'm going to do my best to be as fair as possible in my assessment while still retaining my own thoughts and views on the game. With all of that being said, there will be spoilers. With that forewarning, if you have not played the game before, I recommend it, but only if you go in with the knowledge that the game is old. And feels old. I think it isn't fully necessary, and you'd be better off playing DMC 3 for more of a classic Devil May Cry game. The first 3 games are available for $30 on Steam, and in my opinion, DMC 3 alone is probably worth that much. I also want to mention that I played through this game twice, once on stream and again off stream to get the footage for this. Shameless plug, but if you'd like to see me play more games, check me out on Twitch. We have a lot of fun over there. That being said, let's get into it. The game opens up with a brief story of Sparta, a seemingly interpretive dancer that fought for the humans in the war between humans and devils, and helped lead them to harmony. We teleport to a dark alley where a pretty blonde lady descends from the sky and focuses in on a building with a neon sign that says Devil May Cry. A phone rings, and we hear a male answer it, panning to inside the building where it looks like a college student set up their desk in a Spirit Halloween exhibit, and I say that as endearingly as possible. The male hangs up the phone after saying they're closed, which causes the aforementioned blonde woman to fly through the wall on a motorcycle. We get a legendary line very early on with,
"Whoa, slow down, babe,"
as he panned to a man with white hair and a red jacket. He immediately assumes the woman that survived a head-on crash with his wall needs to use the restroom and points her to the back. With only 2 pans across the room and 2 voice lines, we can already get an idea of how Dante is. Someone who on the surface comes off as quite edgy, as he has a drum kit in what seems to be a place of business, various heads and skulls pierced with swords on his walls, as well as empty bottles and pizza on his desk. This is juxtaposed by his voice lines that basically scream early 2000s to me. He's very disarming, and seemingly used to batshit insane things happening around him, and he immediately is presented in a way that is, for lack of a better word, silly. The blonde lady recognizes him as the son of Sparta, who lost his family and name drops him. Dante recognizes she's a devil, and she throws a sword into his chest. It's here we find out Dante is a demon, as he shrugs off the sword through his chest and speaks of his vengeance, seeking out the one that killed his mother and brother. The blonde lady introduces herself as Trish and says she is looking for help, which surprises Dante. And we get a small glimpse of a blonde woman before panning into the first level. I will say that as much as this screams PS2 game intro, I think it's actually fantastic. It very clearly sets the tone for the game, introduces us to what will be 2 of our bigger characters throughout the story, and gives us a motivation for why we're about to embark on an adventure. Dante is presented, as I said before, in an edgy, comical, disarming way when we first meet him, but upon meeting someone who knows about his past, he quickly throws it to the side, unveiling a character with a dark history that is more than just funny quips. We also are showing right off the bat that we are a powerful character, easily surviving a sword through the chest and walking it off. Overall, I really do love the setup for the game, and I remember when I played it, it made me genuinely excited to start the first mission and begin my journey as Dante. We start our first mission outside of a castle, and as we meander our way towards it, we're presented with the fixed camera angles and thankfully no tank controls. All of the early DMC games come with fixed camera, and aside from a few mishaps with the camera flipping 180 and causing you to walk right back through the threshold you came in from, I think it works pretty well for this game. I'll discuss more about that later, since we're continuing forward until entering the castle that we are immediately sealed inside of. This first room serves as a place to get you used to the controls of the game and the general movement, as you have to jump around the lobby finding red orbs in order to open a door to progress. The jumping feels a little stiff at times, but with a few tries it's pretty easy to get used to, and goodness, you better make sure you get used to it. Moving forward, you break some items, jump through some holes, typical things to get used to the level design, until you come across a creature holding a rusty key. Nothing happens when you take it, but when you turn your back, the creature, a marionette, comes to life and attacks you. Thus begins the first combat of the game, and it's fairly obvious that this game originally came in a case with a fat guidebook at the beginning, since there's no prompt on how to attack. It's not really hard to figure out if you cycle through your buttons, and you figure out you can shoot with X and B while you melee with Y. On the surface, it's a fairly simple system, and you don't really need to know any intricacies to get by these first few enemies. The rest of the mission plays out pretty simply, just heading through the door closed by the rusted key and moving into the castle further. So far, despite the lack of direction, the game feels pretty good to play in my opinion. It encourages careful exploration with a ton of items called blue orbs that increase your health while easing you into combat. The game is 21 years old, so the combat itself, it's not the best, but it could definitely be worse. It feels nice that off the bat you get a few different combos, and while it can be overwhelming at first, you can ease into it fairly easily. One thing that completely sucks is the lock-on in this game. There's no indicator as to what you're locked onto. And for a game like DMC that requires directional inputs, like towards for stinger or away for launcher, it's very important to know what you're locked onto. While it could be worse with single enemies, the problem presents itself when you're surrounded by enemies and when you need to hit something specifically. Even without lock-on, Dante will tend to swipe at the nearest enemy, which sounds helpful in theory, but we'll see later on how egregious that can get. The second mission in terms of gameplay is much the same as the first, looking for key items to unlock a door to progress. Notably during this mission, you get impaled by another sword, this time one named Alistair that crackles with electric power. Alistair is a direct upgrade to the sword we currently have that gives us access to Devil Trigger, a sort of install move that makes us much faster and stronger, as well as the ability to buy different upgrades from the store. I find it kind of odd that the game would give a direct upgrade to our swords so early, especially considering that it adds not only a new gameplay element, but also a whole new menu in the store to worry about. But the moveset is the same, and it's not like it's particularly difficult to ease into using it. Just expect to throw your first sword away and never touch it again. Moving forward, we find ourselves in a library, where we find another key to progress. What isn't obvious is that there's actually a shotgun in here, and if you aren't a serial table breaker, then you can pretty easily miss this. I'm all for being rewarded by exploration, but to have one of the only other consistent guns in the game hidden in an unmarked desk off to the side feels strange to me. I didn't personally miss this, but was 100% shocked when I discovered it. Oh well, more exploring. We use keys, we loop around, and eventually we find an item called the Staff of Judgment. Through context clues, we figure we have to put this into a statue we discovered with Alistair, and on the way back we find a new enemy called Sin Scissors. You better have hoped you grabbed the shotgun and also know how to parry, which the game did not tell you about, mind you. The easier way to deal with these guys is to parry their scissor swings and then blast them with a shotgun. But it can be extremely irritating if you don't know how exactly to deal with them, especially since 3 of them spawn at once. Fortunately, we could also just use the Devil Trigger we got from Alistair, combined with the shotgun to make short work of them. After dealing with them and turning in the Staff of Judgment, the level ends and you get to move on. It's at this point, I think it's fair to talk about the origin of this game. It's a notable fun fact that this game started off as an alpha build for Resident Evil 4. I mean, look at this mansion. It screams Oswald E. Spencer. I think this inspiration is absolutely felt throughout these first few missions, as Resident Evil games are pretty infamous for the same type of backtracking with items you find further in the level to open up new paths. Truthfully, if you turned Dante into a big city cop and took away his sword, this would probably play just like a Resident Evil game. Many of the gameplay elements were inspired by other Capcom games, like Onimusha Warlords and Strider, as Hideki Kamiya wanted to give the game a much more action-y and cool feel. Hell, juggling, which has become such a huge part of the combat in the whole series, was spawned by a bug in Onimusha, where if you hit an airborne enemy, you'd essentially ignore gravity and keep them suspended. It's really incredible in my opinion how Devil May Cry is basically the sum of many of Capcom's other projects, while still feeling like its complete own thing. Back to the story, Dante continues to head through the castle, finally going outside, getting struck by lightning and falling into the ocean, and getting another key item that he can use, the Pride of Lions. This time though, upon heading backwards into the cathedral he left from, Dante is met with the very first boss of the series, Phantom. Very mixed feelings on this boss. While I was doing my research, I learned that it actually has more attacks than Artorias from Dark Souls 1, who's considered to be one of the most complex bosses from that game. I'm not saying this to rag on him at all. I'm just genuinely surprised that this boss has that much depth to it, especially with how early this game came out and the fact that it's the first boss. He shoots fireballs, he summons magma pillars, he has a sting and swipes and a grab combo and a jump. He even has an instant kill move that he can use if you're low on health. With all that being said, the fight's pretty brutal the first time you run into it. While I may not have a history in DMC games, I usually have thousands of hours spread out across various Souls titles, and even I struggled with this guy for a good bit. That's because this boss isn't just a punching bag that hits back. He has armor that forces you to either jump on his back or take him head on. You're gonna have to use everything you've learned in the game so far, and more, to take this boss on, which I really like. I'll get more into the details of what I dislike about this boss later on, but for your first meet with him, I think he's genuinely a lot of fun. On a subsequent playthrough, I learned that you can just use Devil Trigger and Stinger to stunlock him, but I was only able to do that with confidence I'd gained from fighting this boss before. Story-wise, he's sent by Mundus to stop you, of course being promised great power if he's able to. There's some good dialogue between him and Dante before and after the fight, and it doesn't feel forced or shoehorned or anything like that. As you move on to the next mission, it actually starts with Phantom chasing you down a hallway. I originally had a lot of bad things to say about this part, but I actually learned that the door you have to go through is right next to where you start getting chased by him, so you don't even have to run down the entire hallway. It feels kind of odd for them to still give you the whole hallway, but I digress. I do think that this part is very strange though, considering we just defeated Phantom in a boss fight. For him to be coming back so quickly and putting us into a strange little quick time event with him, I don't know, it sort of just rubs me the wrong way. As you turn in the Pride of Lions, you get jumped by a new enemy, the Shadow. You get introduced to possibly the most insane song in this entire game, Psycho Siren. Just give it a listen. Devil Trigger had some very humble beginnings. Overall, the music in this game is pretty good. I still find myself listening to some of the songs on Spotify, and one of the boss themes absolutely rips. You'll genuinely be hearing the same songs on repeat though. The song that plays when you fight normal enemies is Pubic Enemy? I looked this up and yes, it's genuinely supposed to be Pubic Enemy. Many people say it's a mistranslation and it should be Public Enemy, but everywhere I looked, even on the official Steam album for DMC1, it's listed as Pubic Enemy. I can't say I'm terribly surprised, considering there's also songs called Red Hot Juice, Final Penetration, I'm Coming, and Blue Orgasm. But it's definitely so odd. You just heard Psycho Siren, which plays anytime you fight a mini-boss and makes fighting those mini-bosses just a little extra annoying. The best way I heard it is from someone who said it sounds like you're getting arrested 70 years into the future. There's Lock and Load, which is probably my favorite normal battle theme because it doesn't get terribly repetitive compared to the other ones, and it's a bit easier on the ears. Finally, there's Anarchy in the UW that plays in the Underworld. I think DMC1 genuinely has the most different soundtracks for combat for a single character. Even with that, the music isn't horribly crunchy, and while it may get repetitive as you run from room to room, I never found it horribly annoying, except Psycho Siren. You'll see why later. That tangent out of the way, the fight with Shadow is pretty tough. This is only half of why I said you'll be seeing Phantom storming down that hallway multiple times, since this guy is super fast and deals a ton of damage. He's also immune to melee attacks until you soften him up a bit, so you're gonna have to pull that shotgun or Ebony and Ivory out again. He'll enrage and try to blow you up. Do your best to not let that happen. The rest of the mission has you seeking out the Death Sentence, an ornamental sword that you have to climb a tower for, which you use to acquire the Melancholy Soul. This leads to one of my absolute favorite fights, not only in this game, but the whole series, Nello Angelo.
This stinking hole was the last place I thought I'd find anyone with some guts.
Nello Angelo is a pretty sick fight, manifesting as Dante's reflection and challenging him in a taunting manner, seemingly reflecting the Devil Hunter style. The battle is an excellent balance of offense and defense, learning his moveset and learning where you can punish him. If you mess up though, it feels like getting hit by a truck. He has many abilities similar to Dante as well, and will jump across the arena you fight him in, going from an open courtyard to tight castle walls, causing you to think of how his attacks will interact whether you have more or less space to dodge. I've always preferred the sword user versus sword user fights in these games compared to fighting big monsters, as it feels like a more acute sense of your skills and combat prowess. And I feel like Nello Angelo captures that perfectly. His theme is also beyond amazing, and fighting him is one of the coolest feelings in the game. That being said, if you die to him, you will have to deal with Phantom trying to scorch your cheeks, as well as Shadow trying to eat you again. So if you end up dying over and over, it can get irritating very quickly. The next mission to come up is a speed mission, requiring you to make it to the bottom of the tower you climb to get the death sentence within 3 minutes, or the melancholy soul will run out of energy. I never really liked timed missions, but I feel like they're as popular in early 2000s games as quick time events were in early 2010s. It's not too difficult of a time trial, all things considered, especially since if you're so inclined, you can just run past a ton of the enemies. By now though, you've probably picked up some upgrades, and it isn't terribly difficult to deal with them. Upgrades in this game are pretty nice and straightforward. With Alistair, you can get an ability called Stinger, which is used by locking on and pointing the stick towards the enemy and pushing Y. It sounds kind of finicky, but once you get used to it, you'll be set for the entire series. You can also get a double jump and a few other upgrades, including some fun double trigger abilities. While the system feels pretty decent, the age shows in that realistically there aren't a ton of upgrades. Even getting upgrades like Stinger, Air Raid, Round Trip, the combat mostly feels the same. Later on you'll get weapons that have upgrades as well, but it just never really felt complete to me. I guess beggars can't be choosers, but I didn't really find myself trying out many of the different things in this game, which kind of caused combat later on in the game to stale out, since there really wasn't anything new for the player to use. Upon reaching the base of the tower, we end up moving into a sewer system. We reach our first red orb fountain that dispenses red orbs the more you hit it, which is a very welcome addition in case we ended up stocking up on items after the Nello Angelo fight. I haven't talked about orbs, but it's pretty simple. Red orbs are currency for items or upgrades, blue orbs increase your health, gold orbs give you a continue from a checkpoint, and purple orbs increase your devil trigger gauge, but you can only get those in the shop. Similar to the castle, we'll be looking for lots of keys and key items here. The first one being a pretty typical rusty key that spawns some stinky flies. These guys aren't so bad, just use guns, or if you're feeling a little spicy, give them a good old helm breaker. Moving forward, we get trapped in a room with an enemy called Death Scissors, and I'll tell you now, I still have no idea how to fight this enemy. They're similar to Sin Scissors, but much worse and extremely tanky, not really falling victim to the same things you'd use on Sin Scissors. I honestly just found myself mashing my shotgun and using my sword the 30% of times I could actually see it, since it did pretty often clip into walls. Not helping the fact is that Psycho Siren plays while fighting this thing. I'm sure I could have figured it out, but it's much easier to just say that this is a shit enemy, as most people that have played this game I've talked to agree. After dealing with this goober, we can acquire the Guiding Light, which starts another time trial mission. I'd say around here is when I started to get a little tired of the level design. The Resident Evil inspiration absolutely makes itself known as we have to go back up the tower that we time trialed down in order to get the sewers, and we end up in nearly the same exact place that is Nello Angelo's room. I really dislike that there's basically a reverse of the mission that occurred, 2 missions ago? I'd hardly call the sewer a reward-worthy area for defeating Nello Angelo, and even then we spent very little time there before heading right back up to where we came from. The time limit this time is your health bar, which is constantly depleting, making you a bit more wary of combat and more inclined to just run past enemies when given the option, though it will tank your style ranking. It occurs to me that we're about a third of the way through the game, and I haven't mentioned the style ranking. The styles in DMC1 started pretty rudimentary compared to the later entries. For this game, it kind of feels like as long as you keep doing damage without getting hit, you'll reach an S. I assume this is mostly because there isn't nearly as much variety in what you can do in this game compared to the newer ones. But all in all, it doesn't really feel too bad. I think you can definitely still pull off some stylish combos, but lots of things like weapon swapping and styles aren't present in this game. The game also doesn't have style decay, but instead instantly drops everything you've built up if you don't stay in combat. If you get hit as well, your style tanks, which is kind of unfortunate since some enemies have very quick attacks or things that sort of just come out of nowhere. I think that its addition to the game is definitely fun and neat, but it's not quite as fleshed out as it would eventually become, so it's not quite as satisfying to get those high combos. From this point on, I'm going to be mostly breezing through the story, since this point in the script is when I started to get a little impatient in the game. I think for the most part, this is where the video may take a bit more of a negative turn, as the upcoming areas and whatnot were pretty annoying for me to get through. The start of the next mission has us fighting Phantom again, with only a single new move and otherwise the exact same fight. I truly understand this being an old game, but it feels awful to only fight one other boss before getting a third encounter with the same boss. We finish up in the castle, we find a grenade gun, and it'll probably trivialize most normal encounters, and then we finally manage to escape, entering a new map. This new map comes with new enemies, the Blade. They're much tougher than the earlier marionettes and often have abilities that will interrupt your combos, either up close or from afar. From here, you can just progress normally and encounter one of the most annoying parts of the game: platforming. Now, I don't mind a little bit of platforming. I think it adds a fun little challenge in certain areas, and it's fun for traversal. But this part of the game takes platforming to the next level. In order to get your next weapon, you have to platform across many moving little platforms, and it's beyond annoying with the fixed camera angle and stiff jumping. Just for normal progression, from this point, you'll find yourself platforming. God, you're always platforming. This is worse than Path of Pain. Your reward, however, is Ifrit. Fire aspected gauntlets that trade the fast slashes of Alistair for slow, weighty punches and kicks. These things are pretty cool. That being said, they were a bit too slow for me, and so I decided to shelf them for the most part in my first playthrough. I actually used them a fair amount in my second playthrough, and realized that while they're slow, they actually work really well, as you can charge up your attacks in the frames where you end up stunning enemies, and it chains together super well. We also get a new boss fight with Griffin.
Son of Sparta who challenges the darkness for this.
Block off, Featherface!
I hate this boss. If it weren't for the fact that you had to dodge attacks every so often, I'd put it on par with Infested Chopper. It really feels like you're just spamming your grenade gun while he flies up in the air, waiting for a stagger or any opportunity to use a melee attack against it. I'm not sure if I missed it, but that seems to be the best way to fight this guy. There's platforms that get spawned every so often, but trying to jump on these in the middle of a boss fight is like trying to watch a rat run across a 2x4 coated in butter. I just personally find no joy in this fight, and was pretty frustrated by it. Even on my second playthrough, I actively looked for ways to use melee, but learned that you'll get infinitely more use out of double triggering Ebony and Ivory, and mashing that shoot button like potatoes on Thanksgiving. Upon further research, I learned that there's actually a bug in the HD collection that makes it so his core isn't exposed when you knock him down, which most likely led to me being annoyed by it. Surely we won't have to deal with this guy again in the future. Fighting Griffin brings up an interesting balancing act that I think for the most part DMC struggles with early on, but figures out the longer the series goes on, and that's the risk-reward between using your melee weapon versus your ranged options. What seems to be the general idea is that using your melee options will grant you more damage and increase style meter, but obviously puts you in more danger, since you're right next to the enemy. On the flip side, guns generally do less damage, don't generate style on their own, but keep you at a safe distance. DMC1 does not feel like it really has that balance, as using the shotgun at close range will knock enemies down and deal tons of damage, while a double-triggered Ebony and Ivory will melt enemies like plastic in a microwave. Really, the only melee option I can think of that's wildly stronger is Inferno, and you basically just use that if you feel like one-shotting annoying enemies. Add on to this that the style system in DMC1 doesn't really feel like it has value, and it feels like there's very little reason to use melee outside of stun-locking enemies. The next mission kind of feels like a filler with a fun little puzzle that requires you to go through the same exact area multiple times, but follow a white light that will either go down the left or the right. I thought it was really cool, fighting the exact same path for 70% of the mission. At this point, I do want to talk on the enemy variety, because despite my seeming salt, it's actually good. Marionettes are the very basic enemies you find, and in a way, everything kind of builds on it. Fetishes, another type of marionette, will punish you if you just spam your attacks. Student sights are annoying, but present a different kind of challenge, prioritizing precision over brute force. Blades are fast and can be irritating, but if you use Ifrit and the grenade gun that you get as you progress, it makes them much easier to deal with. The game does a really great job of making sure you use your entire arsenal to deal with the various enemies. Really, my only gripe is with random mini-bosses. Psycho Siren aside, I find the Shadow and Death Scissors to be some of the more annoying enemies in the game. And since it's randomly generated, whether you'll end up fighting a group of marionettes or 2 Death Scissors, you'll always be on edge with what's to come. Around now, we're a bit past the halfway point of the game. Up to this point, the game's been somewhat enjoyable, but the lack of direction and just being told go here, go there is getting a little grating. One of the things that I dislike is the map. I don't know if I just didn't play enough old games or what, but oh my god, it's awful. Never once did I open the map and feel like it helped, and around the point that we entered the canyon, it ended up confusing me more than anything. As with most classic games, the game doesn't really guide you on where to go, it's up to you to figure it out. It's mostly intuitive, and admittedly the only reason I got extra lost at some point was because I decided to check everywhere but the door that was right next to me. That being said, it almost feels like the map was added out of necessity, and I think you'd be better off not really looking at it. I feel the need to specify the game was mostly enjoyable, because now we get into our first water level. We're gifted a needle gun and controls for the fabled underwater segment. I've never really felt the momentum of the game crash and burn as hard as it did for me here. All of the controls of jumping around, using your weapons, building up style, was completely taken away for a segment where you can barely steer yourself, and you can only use a silly gun. I wish I could put into words how awful it feels to do this section, but hopefully the gameplay will suffice. But good lord, I think that this level was a turning point for me. This is, in my opinion, a perfect example of a filler level, and I'm 99% positive the game would have been perfectly fine without it. I understand the purpose of this is to acquire the Staff of Hermes, a very important item, but I just feel like it could have been absolutely done without this horrid section. To top it all off, you get to not only fight a death scythe in a huge wide open area, but you get another go at fighting Griffin. Same process, but some of his attacks are a little different, and the map of the ship makes it so difficult to jump around and even try to get any melee hits. So you end up just using ranged attacks until you get double trigger, you pull out Ebony and Ivory, and you hopefully get through it before you lose your mind. The next two missions are mostly just getting back to the point you need to in order to progress the story, but they hide some secret missions. Secret missions are generally found by going off the beaten path or backtracking to areas you've already been to in a mission, and generally involve a little gimmick. In my playthrough, I didn't get all of them, though I also didn't actively search for them. Generally, they just require to do some sort of platforming, kill certain enemies in a certain way, etc, etc. And though I didn't actively pursue them, I think that they're either fun little challenges or the most obnoxious thing in the game. The rewards for them are blue orb fragments that will increase your max health, so while they're not necessary, you definitely do get rewarded for being a little adventurous. As much fun as it would be to run through all the secret missions, there's secrets for a reason. So if this video does make you want to play, you can have a lot of fun looking for them. After doing some errands, we return to the Colosseum and are on the hunt for more items. At this point, I really do think I'll be going into less detail, since they just boil down to look for this item, fight this enemy, get the item, and put it here. There's nothing wrong with it, but at this point for sure, I felt like the gameplay loop was just getting tiring. One thing to note is that there's been literally zero story progression. We haven't heard from our blonde babezilla since the beginning of the game, and the only dialogue we get is Dante calling Griffin Featherface and him talking to Phantom. I'll have to play more games from this time period, but I just got super bored playing because there was nothing really happening. Later DMC games either give you many new weapons or hosted a massive amount of upgrades to the weapons you have to make the movesets more interesting. They also had actual stories to them to keep you relatively invested in the game. DMC 1 being the first in the series wasn't quite as expansive, so for the whole game you're basically stuck with Alistair and Ifrit. If you're like me and you didn't really enjoy the playstyle of one of them, you get a single weapon for your whole playthrough. The gameplay loop begins to feel very stale at this point, especially since no new enemies are really being introduced, and you're looping back to areas you've been in already. And I'd say it's at this point that I kind of just wanted to finish the game for the sake of finishing it, rather than want to see how it ends, if that makes sense. After you go down some paths though, you eventually find a pair of lances, you're granted entry to the Colosseum, and you get an epic showdown with... Griffin. It's Griffin again. For the love of God, it's Griffin again, and it's even worse somehow. Some of the camera angles you get in the Colosseum fight make it literally impossible to see what he's even doing. He won't even be on the screen. This was by and large the most frustrating fight with Featherface that there is. Probably the most irritating fight in the entire game. He retains all of his moves that you can barely see coming, and as usual, just grenade launcher spamming or double triggering Ebony and Ivory is the way to go. That being said, once you deal enough damage to Griffin, one of his wings ends up getting bonked, and he won't be able to fly. But it doesn't make the fight much better. He retains his moveset for the most part, and at this point it's very much just a grit your teeth and bear it moment, as you try and finish off the bird for the last time. On the bright side, after finally destroying Griffin, we get to descend into the Colosseum and acquire the Wheel of Destiny. We're on mission 16 at this point, and with the Wheel of Destiny in hand, we make our way back to the castle. Shout out to Secret Mission 9 here for being one of the most absolute brain-melting ones that there are. Re-enter the Colosseum after exiting for this one. It's really fun. Once you eventually get back to the castle, you'll find a new enemy type, the Plasma. They must have heard that I was getting a little annoyed with what they had. I'll be fully honest with you, I don't actually remember any of the new enemies though from this point on, and it kind of felt like I was encountering them for the first time in my second playthrough. These guys aren't too annoying, they split whenever you hit them, but I've learned that if you just use Ifrit, you can blast them and it'll kill them super easily. After some more running around, we end up back in the cathedral, where we had first fought Phantom. The cathedral looks dank and dim, with a disgusting pool on the floor, which ends up becoming... Nightmare. The next boss, and a unique boss up to this point. The boss is actually pretty neat, combining gimmicks with a relatively deep move pool. No pun intended. The first thing you'll notice is trying to attack the goober seems to do nothing, and the next thing you'll notice is probably the massive glowing wheels on the walls. While in goop form, Nightmare has access to a few attacks and can spawn a few enemies, and if it catches you in a certain attack or two, you'll be teleported to the evil dimension. Fight your way out of here. Would you believe me if I told you that you had to fight Phantom in here? And you'll emerge, dealing fat damage and decreasing defense. Upon looking it up now, I see there's actually quite a ton of mechanics to this fight, but admittedly when I played, I just went to hit the wheels and then went into double trigger to air raid the glowing cores on Nightmare. I mentioned near the beginning of the video that sometimes Dante would just attack the nearest enemy if you weren't locking on. Even without lock-on, Dante would tend to spike with the nearest enemy, which sounds helpful in theory, but we'll see later on how egregious that can get. And this shows a ton when you're trying to hit the wheels on the wall. It gets to be very annoying when you just want to hit the wall and end up swinging at nothing while Nightmare beats her ass. Whenever the wheels finally got hit though, like I said before, I would just end up double triggering and tanking the damage. On my second playthrough, I just spammed Inferno from Ifrit, and it did a crazy amount of damage. The fight's not bad, though. I think it was mostly just refreshing to get a fight that wasn't Griffin, and to have a completely new fight. But I do think that I had a really good time doing the puzzle and being rewarded with a damage opportunity. After Nightmare, we get to run through the castle a bit more, and learn about the demon world, which surely isn't foreshadowing. We also get introduced to another new enemy, the Frost. You can use Ifrit to kick his butt, because Alistair won't put a dent in these things. They have a ton of ice armor, and using Inferno from Ifrit will actually end up just one-shotting them. Interestingly enough, and something I haven't really spoken on, is the different difficulties in this game that change enemies that show up. You actually won't even encounter Frosts on easy mode, instead having Plasma spawning here. On higher difficulties, you'll encounter more death sights and shadows, while lower levels, you'll find blades replacing the harder enemies. I love the way that the difficulty is done personally. One of my biggest gripes with games is that nothing really changes, and enemies just get massive amounts of health and deal massive amounts of damage. But the dynamic enemy swapping of Devil May Cry is one I definitely adore. I played through on normal since this was my first DMC experience, and felt like it was really challenging, but rewarding. I've had thoughts to go back on Dante Must Die to really experience the pain, but I don't think I would do that for this game in particular since the skill ceiling doesn't seem quite as high as the other DMC games. If you don't care for spoilers, go watch the final boss fight in Devil May Cry 5 on Dante Must Die. People have done that hitless, and honestly, it just might be the pinnacle of gaming. Continuing forward, we enter Jurassic Park a few million years too late, but fortunately the spirit is still alive, as we have to navigate a jump puzzle with a skeleton T-Rex shooting fireballs at us. After some time, I realized it actually isn't a jump puzzle, and the solution is to smack the fireballs back at the T-Rex and destroy the treasured artifact. The game made it quite clear what you had to do. It's completely my fault that I didn't read, and I got a little frustrated with it until I realized that it told you what to do right when you entered the room. After that, though, we have a Resident Evil style puzzle where we have to align the light from a mirror and then acquire Quicksilver, our next key item. We leave and head towards the Castellan throne room, which will be a familiar setting as it is where we will once again encounter Nello Angelo. The final fight with Nello Angelo slaps, and he's even stronger than he was the previous 2 times you fought him. You can now summon swords that vastly increase his moveset. This guy honestly has more attacks than an Elden Ring boss. Some of his animations are cut shorter, which may make some of his punish windows different, meaning that you'll get smacked for trying to punish moves the same way you did in his previous fights. I think Nello Angelo is one of the best bosses, honestly, in the whole series. I think I've said it before, but his song is just so good, and I feel like Devil May Cry is at its best when you're fighting another knight-like character. The pacing of it, the skill required, and the fact that you can't really cheese it the same way you would other fights feels so fantastic. This is kind of a weird time to bring it up, but I do so because this Nello Angelo fight was the first time I used any items. I had wanted to go through the whole game without any items, but then I realized it felt kind of silly to play the entire game without experiencing what it was like to use them. I'd used a Vital Star since I was so close to the end of the fight and didn't want to die, which is an item that refills your health. It's probably the most common item you'll find and the only way to heal outside of using Devil Trigger. There's also the Devil Star for that, which refills your Devil Trigger gauge. This one is super useful for fights like Nightmare, where you just want to face tank through stuff without the fear of getting smacked back. The ultimate in face tanking though is the Untouchable, which is essentially a Mario Gold Star that makes you completely invulnerable and grants you infinite Devil Trigger while it's active. I actually never used one of these, but I imagine it's mostly useful for deleting a boss or getting rid of death sights or other annoying enemies. Lastly is the Holy Water, which you activate to deal heavy damage to all of the enemies around you. It's pretty obviously mostly useful in hordes. Unfortunately, my ego didn't allow me to use tons of these items since it detracts from your end of mission score, which is consistent through all DMC games. That being said, I think there's nothing wrong at all with using them, since at the end of the day it boils down to playing how you want to play. After defeating Nello Angelo, you're granted 2 items, the first of which is the Perfect Amulet. At the end of the fight, we get a story beat, and learn that Nello Angelo is Dante's long-lost brother Virgil, who was enslaved by Mundus. We use the amulet he wore to recreate the Perfect Amulet that once belonged to their mother. The second is the legendary Devil Sword Sparta. Sparta's kind of a letdown in this game. I used it for about 2 enemies before switching back to Alistair. It doesn't let you build Devil Trigger, and while it deals a bit of extra damage and has bigger reach, it doesn't get Air Hike, which I'd gotten completely used to at this point in the game. Having none of those abilities felt like a huge downgrade to me, so I ended up faulting it to never really use it again. The next mission, though, has an underwater section in it, so I already hate it. But it also is mostly just running back through the castle in order to acquire Philosopher's Egg. We eventually make it back to the Fountain Room, where we will have another encounter with Nightmare. The fight's basically the exact same, and he doesn't gain any new moves. Though if you get sucked into the evil dimension, you end up fighting Griffin, so this is already the worst version of this fight. You can basically do the exact same strategy you used previously with Nightmare, and you'll probably be fine with this fight. After finishing that up, we find our way into the mirror world through Nello Angelo's mirror, and it's here we were sure to find the Nightmare Beta weapon. You can find this earlier, way back in the Colosseum, but if you didn't find it there, you'll grab it here. The gun draws on your Devil Trigger to shoot, so if you enjoy going into Devil Trigger, you probably won't find much use for this. That being said, it shoots fast enough and has ricocheting bullets, so it's a very easy way to build up your style gauge. I definitely had fun with it, but shelved it pretty quickly. It's a little disappointing that, at this point, I find myself still using Alistair and Ebony and Ivory, but I think that may speak more to my preferred playstyle than anything else. Heading to the courtyard from the mirror world, we encounter a new enemy, the Nobody. These guys are annoying as heck, jumping around and having very jerky movements. When you deal enough damage, they turn into an even larger form of itself, throwing bombs and being a general nuisance. I think that the monkey paw curled when I said I was getting tired of fighting marionettes over and over. In addition, when they die, they don't immediately drop orbs and end up blowing up and dealing damage, so that's another thing to deal with. With all of that out of the way though, we find the Philosopher's Stone and continue forward, heading through the pool that was Nightmare into the Underworld. Sadly, we don't get to do too much exploring before once again encountering Nightmare, doing a similar thing to what he has always done. This time in the evil dimension, you'll fight Nello Angelo. This automatically makes this version the best. In a surprise twist, when you get close to killing Nightmare, Trish, who sent you on this whole quest to defeat Mundus, will appear and betray you. It's up to you to juggle the Trish attacks and the final bits of Nightmare's health bar, which will eventually give way to a final core. Keep up the assault, and eventually it'll bring down the final core and Nightmare for good. This point of the game is where the story starts to pick up. Despite her betrayal, Dante dives to save Trish from falling debris in the aftermath of the fight. She questions him, and despite his seemingly newfound distaste for Trish, Dante tells her that she reminds him of his mother before telling her that he never wants to see her again. It's a very nice moment, I think, since it shows that despite having the Devil Sparta's blood flowing through him, Dante is able to exhibit human restraint and emotions, caring more for life than death and destruction like the demons around him. The next stage is simply a large exploration puzzle, as you have to get the blood pumping to a heart to open up a door. I like these types of puzzles lots more than the typical find an item and go back here and there. It feels nice to connect the dots and open up the doors and whatnot, though at this point I can't explain how I'm feeling. I broke up writing the script a few times, and I noticed that once I got here, I said that I didn't like the gameplay loop of DMC1. Many of these new enemies that are introduced, such as Frosts, Plasmas, and Nobodies, feel more egregious to fight than anything, and there hasn't been any stark differences in gameplay. I realized on my second playthrough that for almost all of those enemies, you can just use Ifrit to one-shot them. So it feels odd that there just seems to be a skeleton key to deal with basically every type of enemy. I think in total my playthrough was around 10 hours, but it genuinely just felt like 10 hours of doing the exact same thing. I felt this doubly as hard on my second playthrough, as not having a chat forced me to give all of my attention to the game. And even though the second playthrough I beat in about 3 hours, it felt like 20 hours. Because it was just running around, using Stinger and Inferno or shooting enemies. I just wasn't really having fun. I felt like I was in purgatory, just getting items over and over and over. Not purgatory. Is this hell? Yeah, it is. The age absolutely shows in the next mission, the legendary battle with Mundus. I'm unable to really do the cutscenes justice here, but Mundus basically turns on Trish, Dante gets upset, and he launches his attack on the Devil Prince. The first stage of this fight is insane. It turns into a shooting segment where you become the Devil Sparta, and you have to play this first stage as a rail shooter. Out of nowhere, we've turned from Devil May Cry to Space Harrier, and I honestly despise it from a gameplay perspective, but can't help but laugh at it looking back to when this game was popular. I can't even sit here and act like it isn't fun, because it sure as hell is. My jaw dropped when I saw that we had thrown the conventions of the combat we've built out of the window in favor of this for the final boss fight in the game. Devil Trigger can be used to really blast him, and the end goal is to destroy the barriers surrounding Mundus. When you eventually triumph over him in this phase, you get to fight his second phase. You start phase 2 with the health you had at the end of phase 1, so you either have to play extremely well or use a vital star to make sure you're healthier for this. I opted for the vital star. You're also automatically equipped with Sparta, but you gain access to Devil Trigger and Air Hike, as well as Meteor from Ifrit, so you've basically got the ultimate sword. This section of the fight sees you returning to the regular gameplay loop, with Mundus spawning platforms that you have to navigate in order to fight him. I really want to like this phase, as it's the culmination of everything, and you have such a cool usage of Devil Trigger. Your sword attacks become ranged, and your blasts are basically the same as they were in the Space Harrier level. But oh my god, the platforming. All of the platforms are above a pool of lava, and trying to jump around the platforms while hellfire and brimstone rain down upon you is sickening. I mentioned before that platforming is fun in small amounts, and for exploration, but using platforming in a boss fight that also has a ton of moves that require precise dodging is hell. Especially when the platform mechanics in this game are as bad as they are. This fight, unfortunately, left a very sour taste in my mouth, and I ended up just using all of the Devil Stars I had to try and kill him as fast as possible. Upon successful completion, Mundus will perish. You'll be teleported back to the room you first encountered him in, and you'll unlock one of the absolute best voice lines in any Devil May Cry game. No competition.
I should have saved you. I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
The final level is another time trial, really putting the pressure on as you escape the underworld. For the most part, you can just run past enemies until you get to the normal cathedral, where you'll just have to fight some blades. You'll eventually get dropped into the sewers, where Mundus will fight you one final time, but this fight is super easy compared to previous fights. I just wanted to finish it, so I used whatever Devil Stars I had and invincibilities, and went nuts on the guy. Trish shows up, seemingly surviving the Devil World, and imbues you with her power. You have to gain Devil Trigger here and then fire a Devil Trigger shot, which will coin you the very first
Jackpot
of the series.
Dante.
From here, it naturally follows that Dante enters the museum biplane that somehow fell into the sewers and didn't explode, and uses it to fly out of the collapsing island, eventually being free and finishing up Devil May Cry 1. What a complete trip. The ending segment honestly was such a brain blast for me, and it was the cherry on top for the absolute shit show that I played through. That being said, I think it's worth talking about the game as a whole, and sort of summarizing all of my thoughts on it. I know I've sung some praises for the game, but overall I really believe the game just has aged so horribly. I think that you can definitely make the argument that the game should be afforded some slack since it's the first Devil May Cry game, and for sure it did a really great job at being something different. It did such a fantastic job of being such an awesome action game. But playing this game in the year 2023 definitely doesn't feel good. The overarching story of it is abysmal, with the middle part of the game very much feeling like a you're only doing this because it's a video game type of progression, rather than being story driven. Really, the only character you see is Dante, and it feels like he gets almost all of his characterization out at the beginning cutscene, and you don't get to see too much else until the very end of the game. However, rating a Devil May Cry game for its story kind of feels the same as judging Pacific Rim for its romantic subplots. For these games, gameplay is king, and while it's probably revolutionary and fantastic back when the game was first released, I feel like it's just aged like spoiled milk. I'm not the type of person to find one thing that's optimal and just use that. I generally do like to try and experiment with what the game gives. It just feels like the game doesn't really give you too much to work with. You get one sword that feels worth using, as the others are just an inferior version of it, and one set of fists, and you don't get too much excitement with the guns. A lot of the enemies don't feel super engaging, either being super simple marionettes or ridiculously annoying scythes or nobodies. There's only a few enemies I think are enjoyable to fight, with a decent few others feeling like a slog. By the end of the game, it just feels like a waste of time to try and do sword combos because, well, there's nothing cool you can really do with them. It feels genuinely pointless to even use Alistair when you can switch to Ifrit and use Inferno to one-shot an enemy, or use your shotgun with Devil Trigger to stunlock an enemy into submission. One thing that this game does extremely well, in my opinion, is set a precedent. I think that playing this game and then moving on to play 3, 4, and 5 after it really did a fantastic job of showing how far the DMC series has come. It's just the absolute base for those games in a really fantastic way. And as much as I dislike comparing to those other games, I think that the later entries are simply just better in every possible aspect. And I mean absolute base, because oh my god, the difference between DMC 3 and this game is nuts. I won't compare them much, but I'm just happy that Capcom was able to figure out just exactly what people wanted out of the game. It took having DMC 2 in the middle of there to get there, but it worked out at the end. With all of that being said, I'm very much on the fence about recommending this game. I can't in good conscience recommend it to anyone that is looking to get into the genre because it's just boring. It feels pointless to play when you can get around to the Colosseum tomfoolery because you don't get rewarded with anything. The gameplay stagnates, the story doesn't really exist. The boss fights aren't very good, except Nello Angelo. The resolution of the game isn't even that satisfying, it's just a few corny lines from Dante. Everyone I've talked to that has played it for the first time recently has told me that the only reason they finished it was because they just wanted the satisfaction of not quitting, not because they actually wanted to finish the game. If you're an enthusiast of the series and have only played the modern games like 4 and 5, then maybe I'd recommend it? Just to know where this game came from. That's like recommending someone to eat unseasoned ground beef to understand where Wagyu comes from. I think I'd rather just recommend DMC 3 if people wanted to get a feel for the older DMC games. I don't know. I think the only reason I'm cutting this game slack is because I really do like the series. I do think Dante is such a cool character, and I think the entire series is probably one of my favorites, so I at least kind of want to like this game. It's so difficult. If what you saw seemed interesting, give it a shot. Like I mentioned before, it comes in a bundle nowadays with DMC 2 and 3, and the third game makes it super worth it. If you try it out with a mod that lets you hot swap between Ifrit and Alistair, it'll probably make it a lot more fun. But I think if you want a good Devil May Cry experience after playing the modern games, you're probably not going to find it here. Hey, thanks for watching. I haven't really done a video like this before, and so I hope you at least kind of enjoyed it. It took a lot of time and effort, but it was super fun to do. I know my opinion probably isn't the most valid since I don't have hundreds of thousands of hours in these games, and it's probably a pretty controversial one, but I just really appreciate this series, and I wanted to make a video like this. If you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe. If this video gets enough love, I'm gonna regret saying this, but I might even make a DMC2 video. We'll see. Thank you again, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.